If you're a woman over 40 who wants to get stronger, chances are you've heard that you should just lift heavy. But what does that really mean? And what are some of the subtleties of programming that you need to consider for getting your best results possible? Thanks so much for joining me today again on the podcast. I'm really excited to have you with me. And today we're going to be talking about what are exactly the ingredients that you need in order to get better results out of your strength training. So often we hear that we should just lift heavy, but what are the things that really go into just lifting heavy? And is lifting heavy by itself truly enough? We're going to answer those questions and more on this episode today. Of course, before we go any further, please hit subscribe on your favorite podcast platform and make sure you head over to YouTube, hit subscribe there as well, and make sure you ring the bell for more notifications. Okay, so we're going to tell a story here. And years ago, when I was in my late teens and early 20s, I worked at a grocery store chain in the Northeast. It's called Big Y. So shout out to anybody who lives in New England and maybe you shop at Big Y. Well, I used to be a cake decorator in the grocery store bakery at Big Y. And it was one of the jobs that I had in the grocery store. I actually started as a bagger, believe it or not, became a cashier. And then I worked my way up to working in the bakery department. First, I started with panning, which we would just lay out all of the stuff for the morning bakers to come in at 4 or 5 a.m. and to start actually baking things off. But eventually, I became a cake decorator, and it turned out I was fairly good at cake decorating. I guess I had the right combination of neatness and artistry that you really needed in order to make custom cakes for people. So it was more than just writing happy birthday or happy anniversary on a cake, but actually we were given creative freedom to really make stuff that was really cool. So when you make cakes and when you decorate cakes, if you've ever done it, you know it's pretty easy to mess it up. And if you don't have a lot of experience, in your mind, you're picturing one thing. And in reality, you're probably getting something that looks a little bit closer to an episode of Nailed It. So if you've ever seen that baking show on Netflix, Nailed It is basically where they take home bakers and they put them through these different competitions. And a lot of times, let's just say the end result isn't the best to look at, even if it tastes pretty good. There's also another show, by the way, where it's called Is It Cake, which they make really amazing fakes. So they take cakes, they make them into other things, and then they have to decide what is cake and what is not. So that's kind of the other end of the spectrum. But as a cake decorator, it was definitely a hard skill to learn. And at first looks pretty easy because there are a lot of skills that are involved in the process of even making the cake. So saying to somebody, just put on the frosting is very different from what has to happen in reality. So that would mean preparing the cake, maybe even cutting it into different layers or assembling those layers to make sure that you have a structure that's sturdy enough. We used to do a lot of cake carving, at least I did. So we would carve the cake into different shapes. You have to make sure that the buttercream icing is very smooth. You have to make sure you crumb coat the cake so that all the crumbs don't just peel off and then end up showing through the frosting. You have to make sure that the frosting is very smooth and that the edges are precise and everything is even. So you don't want layers of cake showing through and then have thick frosting or icing on other parts of the cake. You need to make all of the decorations. You have to write on the cake if that's what the customer has asked for, leaving some kind of a birthday wish, for example, and making sure that it's spelled correctly and it's legible. And by the way, there's the pressure of just making sure it's overall beautiful because somebody is probably going to be using this cake to celebrate an important milestone or life event or a special event. So all eyes are on this cake. And a little side note, I actually made my college graduation cake and my sister graduated around the same time as me because I was doing my teacher training. So I graduated a year later than the rest of my class. And so I actually made my sister's and mine college graduation cake, which I'll try to find a picture and post it online. Because I was pretty proud of that cake. It had her school colors. It had UMass Amherst colors on it. So there you go. So, when you think about cake decorating as a skill, like as a highly trained skill, you can kind of make some parallels to strength training programming. And that's where this episode is going, in case you were like, what does this have to do with getting stronger, Steph? So here's where we transition into that part. there are a lot of folks out in the world, including myself, that say things like women over 40 really need to lift heavy weights. And when you hear that, you need to understand that that is only part of the story. So in reality, the idea of lifting heavy is a training concept. It is a big picture idea. And training concepts are not the same thing as strength training programming. And I know this sounds a little confusing, so we're going to tease that apart in the rest of this episode. In other words, the what, lift heavy, is very different from the how we actually write out a program to get you to lift heavy. Similar in some ways to saying, do plyometrics or add HIIT to your training week. Again, those are the what, right? Heavy lifting, plyometrics, HIIT. Maybe you're talking about zone 2 aerobic base building. Maybe you're talking about adding mobility or movement prep. Maybe you're looking at some hypertrophy programming because you really want to build some muscle mass. So again, the what, all of those things, is different from the how we actually go about creating a plan to get you there. So if you don't have education on how to write your own programming, which the majority of the people listening to this podcast do not, it's, and I'm going to be real honest and blunt and frank here, it's really easy to get it wrong. Again, it seems really easy. Just go in and pick up a heavy weight. So in principle, it sounds simple, but how we actually do it for long-term effectiveness takes a lot of subtlety, a lot of experience, a lot of background in understanding how to actually do those things. And so here's where I get a little bit upfront and say, if you're not experienced in writing programming, don't write programming for yourself. I know it sounds really obvious, but I am making this episode because literally, and I'm not exaggerating, several times a week I get DMs or emails from people who are talking to me about how their programming just isn't working for them, or their strength training isn't working for them. And when I ask, where does the programming come from? There's no programming. It's something that they're making up as they go along. And again, I think that's great that people want to take the initiative to get started. And at the same time, at some point, and it doesn't take very long, you realize that you might be in a little bit over your head, or you're just not seeing much that's actually coming from the programming that you're trying to make up for yourself. So I highly encourage you, if you are not trained in how to do this, that you leave it to the experts, because we're going to do all that heavy lifting for you. No pun intended. So if you are trying to write your own programming and you don't have experience, at best, it means it's going to be ineffective, especially in the long run. Again, we're not here to just lift weights and get strong for a season. At least I think most of the people listening to this podcast are not. This isn't like a crash diet down for 6 weeks and try to look amazing for some cruise or something like that. I mean, maybe that initially gets you in the door, but you realize after a while, like, oh, hey, I actually had to keep this going. So we're looking for long-term consistency. We're looking for long-term results. We're looking for, you staying healthy as possible throughout the process. And at best, it means you're not going to see the results that you came in for. At worst, it could mean injury, overuse, overtraining, burnout, and that you stop lifting altogether. So we don't want that to happen. All right. And I know, again, it's tempting. We think there's so much information on Instagram, and there's so many free workouts on Instagram and TikTok and all these places. But again, it's just because you're seeing a small snippet doesn't mean it's an entire program, and that program is actually going to be helping you move toward your goals. So lifting heavy as a concept doesn't mean it's a good idea to lift to your absolute maximum capacity or intensity or load every session. It doesn't mean never do anything over 5 reps. I hear that a lot where, again, we're out there beating the drum of lifting heavy weights, and people are starting to think, oh, so actually I should only lift sets of 5 or less all the time, ever. Never lift above 5 reps. And I disagree with that. And I'm going to actually tell you why here in a minute. I really like this definition of a program from Barbell Logic. And they say a program is a plan for the process of strength training towards a goal. So quite often when I'll write back to people, I'll say, well, what program are you on? And they're like, well, I'm just lifting a couple times a week, or I'm lifting 5 times a week and I do, a few sets of this or a few sets of that. And I'm like, right, but what's the program that you're actually following? And then sometimes they'll say, well, I'm not actually following a program. I'm making things up on my own. So here's what we need to know. Programs are not random workouts. There's nothing wrong with doing random workouts. I just want to be really clear. So for you, if you're at a time in your life where just getting back to moving your body is where you need to focus, and you're just trying to get moving in general, totally fine. Absolutely fine. Nothing wrong with that. But again, if you have a goal, so I'll read that definition again. A program is the plan for the process of strength training towards a goal. So if you have a goal, you need a program. The program is the plan that's going to take you through all of the little knobs and dials that need to be tweaked in order for you to reach towards your goal. So programs are not random workouts. Again, if you're at the stage now where you're just trying to get moving and you're doing random stuff, that's okay. But most of you come to me and you have a specific goal. You're like, hey, I want to actually get stronger so I can do things around the house easier. I want to feel more capable. I want to go do cool shit with my family. I want to be able to XYZ, you fill in the blank. Or I want to build some muscle. I realize I've started to lose muscle mass as I am going through my 40s, and I'm going through the perimenopause transition, for example, or I'm postmenopausal, and damn, I'm like losing muscle mass. And I know it's really, really important because muscle is an organ of longevity and it helps me to get around. I want to avoid sarcopenia, etc. Maybe you want to improve your bone density or bone strength, right? So we realize now that certain types of training can actually assist with that. So maybe you have those goals and you're like, okay, I need to get focused on this. Then random workouts are likely not going to get you to where you want to go. So just wanted to say that. Programming then is the act of creating the plan for the process of strength training towards your goal. So it is the sitting down and constructing and writing and rewriting and adjusting potentially over time as the athletic individual, the athlete goes through the program. It is the act of creating the plan. And that takes a lot of thinking. It takes a lot of skill. It takes understanding how physiology works, how the body works, how training concepts work, and how we can then understand our audience and put together a plan that will move that person or that group of people toward getting a better result, toward the end goal, toward the actual outcome that you want. So much like decorating a cake, to give a nod back to what we talked about at the top of this episode, there's a lot of nuance and experience that goes into writing a good program. You can write a program. Will it be a good one? I don't know. It depends on your experience level, how much you know about these sorts of things, about exercise, about training, about the body, about recovery, about adaptation, and how we can start moving all of those levers. So in order to program or to write a program, one must consider things like, what are the end goals or the end goal? What is hopefully this person going to be able to be better at doing by the time they get to the end of the program? And side note, we have to be reasonable with our expectations about exactly how long things are going to take. It's very hard to predict exact timelines when it then comes to a real person implementing the program and considering all the other factors of life. So just wanted to put a little nod there. The experience level of whoever this athlete is going to be, whether it's a recreational athlete, it's somebody who's been lifting for a really long time, it's somebody who's never lifted before, it's somebody who's getting back to lifting, it's somebody who's been lifting for many years and has a lot of experience. We need to consider how to progress and periodize the program over time. This is really, really, really important. And it's one of the biggest things that people who try to program for themselves and don't have the experience often miss. They think sometimes, very common, and I get these messages too, I just add weight all the time. And at some point, once that magical beginner's phase wears off and you can't just add and add and add and add a load every week, where do you go? Right? So there's a lot of things, there are a lot of variables that we can tweak or we can consider when we're looking at programming. Things like frequency or split, right? So how often are you going to lift? How many days a week? What is the split going to look like? Full body, upper body, lower body, different body part splits if we're doing more of a hypertrophy or muscle mass program, for example, and everything in between. And I think this is where it gets a little confusing as people think, well, there must just be one right answer. The truth is you could sit down with two different coaches who both are qualified and have experience and come up with two pretty different programs that actually get somebody toward a very similar end result. So there are a lot of differences between programs, and it's unlikely that there's like one, the best program in the world, and that you couldn't get there through two different programs or two different pathways. But there are some things that are going to be considered amongst both of those programs likely, right? So things like progressive overload, how are we tweaking and changing the variables over time? Periodization, like how are we looking at the different phases of the program and helping to move people through those phases? How are we considering things like recovery, for example? So variables, we mentioned, right? Frequency, we look at things like exercise selection, reps, sets, tempo, density, and more. So there's more than one way to progress the program. Again, load, I mentioned earlier, so that's there as well, but it's not the only thing that we can tweak. And we don't want to just keep overloading and never tweaking anything else. It's unlikely that program is going to be very successful. For the long term, it might get you to where you want to go in the short term, but there are more subtle ways to do things. And then we also want to think about additions to the program. So as I mentioned earlier at the top of the show, sometimes people think, okay, well, I know lifting heavy is important. Okay, Steph, I've listened to your podcast enough to know that I need to lift heavy. And again, heavy is always relative, but there are other components that go into a great training plan, and they may include things like movement prep. So how do you actually get ready for the workout, whether that includes mobility or dynamic movements? That could include some connection breaths. So like getting more in tune with what's going on with your pelvic floor, for example. That could include things like a cardio warm up, and could include dynamic stretching, passive stretching, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot that can potentially go into like getting ready to lift. And that actually helps you to get ready psychologically to transition from whatever you were doing before into the actual workout itself. So we need to consider that, right? We have to look at things like potentially stability. So how are we weaving stability into your workouts? Plyometrics, as I mentioned before, everybody's like, okay, cool. I'm starting to get the idea that plyometrics are important, and it's, not something I should necessarily or categorically avoid as I'm getting older. Actually, I want to find a way to make this work for me where I'm at. But you don't necessarily just start jumping, no pun intended, to something like depth jumps or depth drops like right away. You have to actually build up. You have to learn how to land well before you start doing a lot of jumping, especially if you haven't been doing any jumping. Stretching, as I mentioned earlier, like all of these things, your cool down, what are you going to do to bring your body back out of that sort of sympathetic, more stressed state, if you will. So again, we're not going to go into like sympathetic versus parasympathetic, but what are you doing to actually kind of cool down, to get your body back to baseline before you run off to your next thing that you have to do? So just a little fun fact, I want to give a little nod to this to any other coaches that are out there. So even though I've been coaching lifting for over 10 years at this point, I knew I could still get better at writing programs. So last fall, I enrolled in a very rigorous program about long-term programming. And this is from Annie Miller. So if you're looking for a really great program in depth on how to program better for the long term, so anything over 3 months, then definitely go check out Pure Programming. And I don't have a discount code or anything like that, but if you do end up enrolling, I think you can just say, hey, Steph Gaudreau sent me over here. And big shout out to Annie for that program. It was really amazing. But yeah, a program to learn better how to be better at programming. Because even a lot of personal trainer certifications, for example, there's like a little bit about programming, but nothing that's super, super in depth. So just to say that even when you are someone who knows how to program, at least for me, I was like, I want to get better at this and I want to learn different methods and I want to learn how to program for the long term, which is why you're seeing some longer programs coming out from me. So yes, lifting heavy is an integral part of many great strength training programs, but it's not the only thing that you likely should do, especially if you're trying to become more well-rounded and fit in your 40s and beyond. And that doesn't even really touch the cardio aspect that we could go down an entire rabbit hole about, right? Like zone 2 versus HIIT or sprint intervals. And what about the gray zone in between and all of this other stuff. So we're not going to talk about that in this episode, but it is a component of your fitness. So don't think that just because we're not harping on it a lot that it doesn't matter, or we're saying it's not important, because it is. So when you're 40 and above, here's some things you need to keep an eye on and we need to address through your programming. Lots of muscle mass potentially. Now, not all of these are a foregone conclusion, but they are things that increase typically when we're over 40, sometimes due to hormonal shifting, sometimes due to simply the aging process, and sometimes due to disuse. So there are a lot of things here that we can actually impact, right? Loss of muscle mass. We all know we start turning 30 and things start to naturally go on a decline if we don't actually do anything about it. And a lot of times that's due to disuse. Tissue stiffness and, ligament stiffness or joint pain, those sorts of things can certainly increase. Loss of power generation, which means your ability to use your type 2 fibers, and you need to exercise those type 2 fibers if you want to keep them kind of fresh and able to do their thing and respond when you need them, right? So moving very powerfully, very explosively, plyometrics, that sort of thing, super, super important. And it applies to across your regular life. So not too long ago, well, it was probably a year or two ago at this point, we were walking and there's elderly housing down the street from where we live. And there was a much older woman crossing the street. The light started to change. And so she started to lose her, it's free to walk signal. And it was telling her to stop. And she was halfway across the street. So she started moving a little bit faster, shuffling. And then she started to fall. And it was like a scene from a movie. She was trying to catch her balance, stumbling. She stumbled for what seemed like forever, although it probably was only just a second or two, and then fell. And of course we were all rushing over there, are you okay? Helping her get up. She was okay. But it's even things like, can we catch ourselves if we start to stumble and fall? Balance issues on that note, right? So of course we have increased risk of osteoporosis. We have osteopenia, which is that bone density loss. However, balance issues also play into things like our risk factors for bone breaks, right? So are we working our balance and doing it very intentionally? We may have more mobility challenges. We may need longer recovery windows, and we may just experience a possible increase in how unpredictable we feel from day to day. So really learning how to take in auto-regulation, how to work off something like, for example, RPE that is more flexible instead of always facing a percentage and feeling like, well, I can't hit that today. So, oh, well, I guess I fucked up this entire program. So there are a lot of things that we can do differently based on going through our 40s and beyond to start working with what's going on and working with those changes instead of just saying, well, it's just pointless. There's nothing I can do about this. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, adjusting our expectations, because I see plenty of these programs that are like, you're going to get shredded in 6 weeks, or you're going to get, you're going to have some massive body transformation in just a few weeks. And the likelihood of that happening is very, very low, because it just takes time. And then we also have to consider the other synergists that go into this, right? Nutrition, recovery, our mindset about all of this stuff that make the process complete. And we need all of those things to really play together pretty nicely. So hopefully you can see that heavy lifting is just a piece of the puzzle. Okay. And by the time this episode comes out, it'll be very, very soon that my newest strength training program is coming out in the world. I'm not going to give a ton of detail here on the podcast about it because I don't want to give dates. And then, of course, people are going to come across this podcast next year and think, oh my gosh, is this just happening? But the time of recording this, which is August 2023, I am preparing to launch a new program that is specifically designed for women over 40 to help you feel, look, and be stronger. Simply put, right? To help you be more well-rounded, to help you build your fitness in those ways. And so I'd encourage you to take a look at my website, stephgaudreau.com, to see what's the status of the program is, to find out more about it and everything that you have to gain from joining a program. And that's really the takeaway from this episode, is that random workouts, of course, will do something. You are still moving your body, and that is the start. But when you start to realize that strength is important, that adding muscle mass matters, because the more muscle mass we have, the more opens up for us. We can lift heavier things. We can build our capacity to store things like glycogen, right, in our muscles. So we build a bigger glucose sink. We have some metabolic advantages, just being able to move through life more easily, right? Activities of daily living, and also doing cool shit. Like, who wants to do cool shit? I know I do. I want to keep doing cool stuff and experiencing life more fully as I continue to age through the rest of my 40s, my 50s, and beyond. And I'm sure you do too. That's why you're here on this podcast episode. So it's wonderful to want to gather information and learn about all of these different aspects of programming that you probably learned from this show, from Instagram, from following other people in the field. And that's wonderful. But when it really comes down to it, if you want to get the best results possible, get on a program. Find someone that matches your philosophy, your ethos, that you really like, you dig them and their approach, that has a program that works for you and your experience level and the goals that you do have, and follow the program. Trust the process, especially if that person's experienced and they've been through it, right? Personally, professionally, they have the credentialing, they have the background, and they have the know-how. So get on that program, follow the program, let that person do all the planning, the heavy lifting for you. It could be, of course, a templated program. It doesn't have to be personalized one-on-one, or, something where you do one-on-one in-person training. It doesn't have to be that. It could certainly, if that's something you have the resources for and something you're really keen on. But even a templated program can go pretty far in helping you achieve those goals that you have. So take the burden off yourself, get a program, be as consistent as you can. But as I tell the people that follow my programs, if you can do 70 to 80% of the time, you're doing pretty darn good, and you should feel pretty amazing about showing up for yourself, and you will more than likely keep getting great results as long as you keep showing up and you don't let that all or nothing mindset get the better of you. So go check out all of the options that I have available for you over at stephgaudreau.com, and I would love to support you on your strength training journey. All right. Thanks for being with me on the podcast today. I really appreciate it. Make sure you subscribe over on your favorite podcast platform, as well as YouTube. Go ahead and ring the bell over there for more notifications. And if something about this episode stood out to you, or you want to talk about programming, send me a DM on Instagram and let's chat about if and how I can help you. And if I can't, honestly, I'm going to send you to whoever I know is the best fit for what you're looking for, because I want you to get the best results possible. All right. Thanks for tuning in on this episode of the podcast. And until next time, stay strong.